welcome you all to our event tonight. I'm Madison Marston, President of student organization Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi is Latin for Reason for Christ. So we are not your typical Christian organization. We do hold to Christian values, and we believe that we have come to those conclusions and that we believe that Christianity is true based on evidence that we have analyzed from science, from logic, reason, history, and our club makes a large effort to meet once a week to do like smaller Bible study / discipleship groups where we challenge each other on a smaller scale to try to make sure that we are able to defend our beliefs and that we continue to examine new evidence to make sure that what we believe is true. And we like to not only just do this with ourselves, but we like to reach out to other organizations and students on campus to make sure that we're not just engaging among ourselves, but that we're actually engaging with other people as well. So we like to hold events like tonight where we'll have a debate to, address a specific issue or a topic or something very controversial like tonight's event. So like I said, we meet once a week on Thursdays where we do this on a much smaller scale. And it's usually like by topic, or we'll go through like a book. And then every semester we'll have like 2 or 3 big events. So if you want to find out more about how you can get involved with that, we will have information out front. We are also holding an apologetics training later in March. So if you're interested in that, come check us out. I will be present at the end, as well as our VP, Emma, and Aaron, our chapter director, who you'll get to meet later in the evening. But we're not here tonight to talk about Ratio. We're here to listen from Dr. Mike Adams. So let me go ahead and introduce him. Dr. Mike Adams, he is here with us today. He got his doctorate in sociology and criminology in Mississippi. He has been with UNCW teaching since 1993. Many of us know him as someone that we love to hate. We love to hate him because he takes big stands on controversial issues, on conservative issues, on reasons of free speech, and he doesn't leave things alone. So he really likes to address things all the way, which is why we are so thankful to have him here tonight, because we know that we will be able to bring any kind of question to him at the Q&A, and he'll be able to handle it. So I hope you all came prepared with those, because there will be a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Mike Adams.
It is absolutely awesome to be here. This is my 83rd campus to speak on in the United States of America. It took 22 years to get an SGA approval to actually give a speech here at UNCW. I hope we got it. I hope it's well worth the wait and everything. But I just want to start basically by sharing my opinion, because Madison suggested that I have a proclivity towards expressing my opinions. And I got to tell you, that's the worst introduction I've ever heard in my life. I've got to explain, because she left out some really relevant information about my qualifications. And it's really important whenever you get up and speak in front of an audience that you establish credibility. And so I want to talk a little bit about my performance in high school and all that stuff as I kind of set up for this evening's event. Actually, you'll see I was just kidding with Madison. You'll understand what I'm getting at in just a second. But in the year 1993, I actually went through the interview process at UNCW in March at some point. I think I accepted the job around early April. And I was getting ready to move from Mississippi State University out to beautiful Wilmington, North Carolina. And I was about to start my job here at UNC Wilmington on August 1st of 1993. And at that point, I was very much of a leftist, politically speaking. I had voted for Michael Dukakis for president in the year 1988, and a few people just about got up and walked out from the pro-life side, but hold on just a second. Let me explain things. I voted for him in 1988 reluctantly, because I was upset that they didn't have a more socialist-leaning candidate, and he was far too conservative for me, politically speaking, back then. And so I was very much on the left, politically speaking. And I also was a fairly outspoken atheist at the time that I was hired by UNC Wilmington. And again, that starting date was on August 1st of 1993. And just before that, a couple of weeks before that, I had an opportunity to go to my 10-year reunion. And this is actually very relevant to the issue of how I switched my position on the abortion issue. Of course, back then I was pro-choice on the issue of abortion, and I was to the left on all the different political issues of the day. And then something interesting happened in July. I went back home to Houston, Texas, where I grew up, for my 10-year reunion. And it just so happened to be the case when I went home that my mother's best friend, a woman by the name of Lisa Chambers, just happened to be going, they were old friends of ours, and we'd grown up in Houston together, and they'd actually moved off to Roswell, Georgia, and they just happened to be visiting at the same time that I was going to be there. And I was a little bit nervous about this because I was on the left politically at that time. I'd grown up in a conservative home, and then I kind of drifted to the left, and I'd fallen away from the church and all of this. But Mrs. Chambers had just remained absolutely steadfastly conservative throughout her entire life. I mean, this woman was so conservative. You know, I joke sometimes that if she was Catholic, she would have been Attila the Nun, basically. I mean, she was to the right on all these political issues. And when I went to college and graduated in 1987, I actually got my first degree, my bachelor's degree in psychology. And when I did that, I went and got my class ring, and it didn't say psychology, it just said liberal arts, because they didn't have a symbol for psychology. And I remember showing it to Mrs. Chambers, and she said, well, what's the matter? Doesn't your school have a conservative arts? And I remember she used to make remarks to me like that, and they just used to dig at me, and I'd get so angry, and I'd try and respond to her, but I really actually found myself in a position of often not having a good argument. And I couldn't respond to her, so I was a little bit nervous about running into her in July of 1993. And, you know, it's interesting because our families were very close, by the way. My mother and her were best friends. My dad and her husband were best friends. Anyone have a family like that when you're growing up and the kids are best friends, and it's like you're just best families, essentially? And so it's like you have to put up with them. And I was just concerned that at some point during the visit, she was just going to kind of corner me and give me a hard time, and wouldn't you know it, she cornered me one morning at the breakfast table. And she sat there, and you think I'm blunt. Let me tell you, she is even more so. She just brought it up there at the breakfast table. She said, so you voted for Bill Clinton last year in 1992, didn't you? And I tried to make a joke out of it. I said, well, don't impeach my credibility and everything. I tried to do my best impression and kid around, and she was not laughing at all. Okay, she says, well, you do know that he is our very first openly pro-choice president. And I sat there and I said, here we go at the breakfast table. She's going to bring up the issue of abortion. Okay, fantastic. Well, she brought it up and she says, well, I guess that you're pro-choice on the issue of abortion. And I said, as a matter of fact, I am. And she starts to tell me the story about how one of her sons had a girlfriend who worked at a crisis pregnancy center, and she just segues from that into a discussion of ultrasound technology. And she starts talking to me about how ultrasound technology was just a really effective thing that they were using in crisis pregnancy centers, and how so many women will go in and they've pretty much made up their mind to have an abortion, or maybe they're leaning that way, and then they see the information from the ultrasound technology, and then it just changes their heart. And so from that, she started to tell me the story of a man by the name of Bernard Nathanson. And this was interesting because Bernard Nathanson was actually the co-founder of NARAL, which used to be, National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws. And then after Roe versus Wade, I guess it became National Abortion Rights Action League after that. Well, Bernard Nathanson was one of the co-founders, and at some point during the 1970s, this individual who was a co-founder of NARAL and who also performed abortions actually performed an abortion on his own girlfriend. He actually aborted his own child, and then after that, subsequently, he would watch an ultrasound video which actually showed an abortion taking place. And he saw that, and it really basically turned his stomach, and he went through some changes. You know, he was an atheist, ethnically Jewish, and he was an atheist, and he went through a process of reconsidering on that issue, and he also converted to Roman Catholicism. So he went through this conversion, and then after that, he actually becomes an active member of the pro-life movement. Well, it's interesting because he made a decision later on to make a film which would become somewhat famous. It was only 28 minutes long, and he made this film back in 1983. It was a film called The Silent Scream. And in The Silent Scream, it actually shows this abortion taking place, and you can see the instruments and tearing of flesh and things of that nature. And you can sit there and see the subject of this abortion trying to move away from the instruments. And at the end, you see this tiny mouth opening up as if to scream, but no one can hear it. And that brief description of a silent scream was all that Lisa Chambers gave to me. And she actually just threw that out there during our breakfast conversation, and then she tried to move on by saying something like, pass the ketchup or whatever, I don't know. The conversation only went on for about 10 minutes, but she really planted a stone in my shoe because I could not get that image out of my mind. And so what I decided to do later on was to actually go and watch The Silent Scream. I watched it a number of times, and I really thought about that central issue, which I think is the central issue in the abortion debate, which is, what is the unborn exactly? And it's very interesting because that short conversation resulted in my conversion on the abortion issue. And I begin by telling that story for two reasons. I share that story with you for a negative reason and for a positive reason. Here's the negative reason. I think it's extremely unfortunate that a guy goes off. Oh, and I actually skipped the part about my qualifications. When I was home for my 10-year reunion, I have to throw this in, I was actually 734th out of 740 in my graduating class. I graduated with a 1.8 grade point average, and I flunked English all 4 years in a row. So I was really looking forward to going to my 10-year reunion and have people say, what are you up to these days? Where's your parole officer? And turn around and basically say, no, I'm a college professor. Okay, but it's sort of interesting, isn't it, that I went off to college for 10 years. I got an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree in psychology, and then went and got a PhD in sociology and criminology. And here's the negative part. I'd gone to college for 10 years, and I had never really sat there and considered the central issue in the debate, which is, what is the unborn? And I think that says something that's really negative about ideological diversity on college campuses. I mean, there are certain issues out there that we really don't talk about, and they bandy about these terms, and they say, oh, well, the unborn, it's simply a blob of tissue, and no one really has a serious discussion about a lot of serious issues on our college campuses. That really bothers me. You shouldn't be a 28-year-old PhD and never have thought about the central issue in what is arguably the most important moral issue of our time. You should have at least contemplated that central issue. And I hadn't done it at that point. That's the negative part. Let's get the negative part out of the way and say something positive about Lisa Chambers. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the way that she approached the debate. You know, some people, when they get in arguments about serious issues, they will sit there and just argue with a person for hours on end and just sit there and try and beat them down. But what Lisa Chambers did, I thought was absolutely brilliant. She said, you know, I am just going to plant a stone in his shoe and get him to think about the central issue in the abortion debate. And I think that's really praiseworthy that she did that. Let's cut through all of the side arguments and talk about the central issue, because that really succeeded. And it really got me to start conversations with my pro-choice friends. You know, when I watched the film, I actually went and talked to pro-choice friends, and I said, you know, it's really something that you can sit there and you can watch the film, and you can see that the unborn child feels pain because it's recoiling and moving away from the instrument. And some of my pro-choice friends would respond, and they would say, oh, that's not really what's going on. That doesn't prove that the unborn are feeling pain. It's just a reflexive action. And then I would stop and say, hold on just a second, you're admitting that it has a reflex system. That is not a blob of tissue. And I realized on the central issue in the debate, I was being fed false information. It wasn't a matter of opinion, but the information that I was getting was wrong. And so what I want to do this evening is to strongly encourage all of us to take just a minute and focus on the central issue in the debate, which is, what is the unborn? Because we can't deal with any of the arguments until we answer that central question. Now, here's the way that I'm going to go about this. I'm going to show a film and it's only going to be 54 seconds long. I am not going to show a portion of the silent scream. The reason for that is, if any of you have seen the film, you know that Bernard Nathanson narrates it, and there's some kind of scary music in the background, and it's sort of dramatic. And I recognize, as I stand here in this room, that there are unquestionably people who have had negative experiences with abortion. There are women in this room who've had that experience, and many might be fine with that, but others might be troubled by that. I know in addition to that, that there are a lot of men who have had negative experiences with abortion. I have a very good friend of mine who about 20 years ago, he kind of helped fund an abortion and pressure his girlfriend into having one, and then later on he changed his mind on the topic, and it's just a very difficult thing for him. So I want everyone to understand before we show this short film that I am not in any way trying to impose guilt upon someone for a past decision. I believe that the purpose of the pro-life movement is not to impose guilt over past decisions, but to impart wisdom over future decisions. And I honestly believe, my students here know about my criminal past and all of the things that I've done, and drug past and certain felonies that I've committed. And some of my students are kind of looking away right now because they've heard the stories a little bit too often. But the fact of the matter is, if you know me, you know I'm not in a position to judge anyone. And so that's not the purpose of this. What we want to do is show this film that shows the product of abortion after 7 weeks, and after 10 weeks, and after 24 weeks. And the purpose of this is to basically show or deal with the question of what is the unborn. And the reason I've selected this is because there is no narration, there are no words, there's just music. So that if you've had a negative experience, you can just avert your gaze, and it's less than a minute, and this can help us to get down to what is, I think, the central issue in the abortion debate. So with that, I know someone up there behind the bright lights is in charge of the technology, and they're going to go ahead and roll the film. Well, thank you, and that's, again, the only short film that I'm going to show this evening, which I think is very instructive and helps us get down to the central issue in the debate without question. And I want everyone to understand that the purpose in showing that film, once again, is not to cause people to make a decision on the abortion issue on the basis of emotion, okay? There is actually some information in there that we're going to use to deal with some of the arguments here this evening. But I want to begin by saying this. In 1973 in Roe versus Wade, there was an enormous mistake that was made in that opinion. Actually, there were a number of enormous mistakes that were made. One of the mistakes that was made was that Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the majority opinion in that particular case, said that there is a lack of consensus on the issue of when life begins. And he also said that if there is a constitutional right to choose, that if a woman has a right to choose, it is tied to the issue of when life begins. That's what's very strange about Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court said, well, who are we to take sides? We don't know when life begins, but then they turn around and they have effectively granted a right to unrestricted abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. And that is, by the way, what Roe versus Wade said. There's some misunderstanding about that, and I'll circle around to that later. The fact of the matter is, when we take a look at the issue of when life begins, there actually is a consensus on when life begins. I like a quotation from Hadley Arcus, who is a professor at Amherst College, who said that an absence of consensus does not mean an absence of truth. So even if there were disagreement, listen, ladies and gentlemen, there was a time when people disagreed about the shape of the earth. That did not mean that the earth did not have a shape. There still is a truth. And the fact of the matter is, if you go to the leading textbooks in the science of embryology, you find that there really is a consensus on when life begins. And what they say is that each and every single one of us, from the point of conception, is a distinct, living, and whole human being who is actively involved in the process of developing him or herself from the very point of conception. And I want all of you to do this. Do not trust me. Do not take my word on it, because that's what I did when I was a college student. When people came along and said the unborn, well, it's just a blob of cells, I simply accepted what they said. What I want you to do is to seek out information on both sides of the debate. And I'm going to give you some sources this evening. For example, on my side of the debate, there is a brilliant philosopher by the name of Patrick Lee. Patrick Lee, in 1996, wrote a book called Abortion and Unborn Human Life. And in that book, he quotes textbook definition after definition after definition from all of the leading textbooks in the science of embryology that say that life begins at conception. We are all distinct, living, and whole human beings actively involved in the process of developing ourselves from within, from the point of conception. If you look on the other side of the debate, David Boonin is a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he has written one of the most brilliant defenses of abortion. I disagree with his conclusions, but it is a very thoughtful and thorough analysis. And David Boonin says, there's no question about it. From the point of conception, that's a human being. Even Peter Singer, who is considered to be one of the most radical philosophers in the United States of America at Princeton, who says that not only does a woman have a right to unrestricted abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, she should be able to kill her own child to the point of 30 days after birth. He makes the argument that life begins at conception. And this is the only time I will do this evening. I will actually take out a couple of quotes that I want to share with you. One of these is from a man by the name of Alan Guttmacher. Alan Guttmacher was the president of Planned Parenthood in the 1960s, when they were into the issue of contraception, but not yet into the issue of abortion. And here's what he said. This all, talking about how life begins at conception, this all seems so simple and evident that it is difficult to picture a time when it wasn't a part of our common knowledge. He wrote that in the year 1933. In addition to that, in the year 1868, Dr. Horatio Storer, the head of the American Medical Association Committee on Criminal Abortion, says this: physicians have now arrived at the unanimous opinion that the fetus in utero is alive from the very moment of conception. That was our knowledge all the way back in the 19th century. So I want to get up here, and even though I am certainly conservative and certainly fundamentalist on the issue of religion, I want you guys to know I'm no science hater. I am up here relying upon the science of embryology to establish something that is very important. Science tells us that when an abortion is performed, it is performed on a living human being. And that is extremely important, because I believe that one of the fundamental flaws of the pro-choice position is this: they have a propensity to beg the question on the central issue in the abortion debate. And by the way, that phrase, question begging, is something that is so misused in our society. People think that question begging is raising a question. That's not what it means. It means that you're having an argument about something, and you simply assume that you are correct on the central issue, and you proceed from there without providing any evidence to support your position. And I think that's the principal weakness of the pro-choice position. And what I like to do is to illustrate how that actually plays out in arguments that we have about the issue of abortion. There are a number of different arguments that you've heard. Now, the pro-lifers out there, I'm going to throw out some arguments, and I know that all of you are just going to nod and say, oh, yes, I've heard that one before, I've heard that one before. But frequently, people will simply get angry and just shout, it's my body, my choice. Now that happens, I hope no one stands up and starts screaming that this evening, because one time I was given a lecture at the University of Massachusetts, and a woman just got up and started screaming and laced it with a lot of profanity, and the police ended up dragging her out in handcuffs, and it wasn't exactly her choice that evening. She actually went to the county jail, and it was pretty disastrous. But the fact of the matter is that some people do emotionally argue that and just kind of stamp a foot and say, well, it's my body, my choice. And that is precisely the reason why I decided to show that short film. You see, there are a lot of people who will look at the images that I just showed, and they will say, man, you know, the most important image, the most influential image that you see there is of that child at 24 weeks. Because you just look, and it's just so fully developed. And I know that that arouses people's emotions, but what I believe is that of those three different images, by far the most important image is the product of abortion after 7 weeks. That's actually the one that's the most important, because 7 weeks is a very significant number. Most doctors will not actually perform an abortion until about 7 weeks after conception. And the reason for that is that in the process of tearing flesh and removing basically the aftermath of that abortion doctor has to be absolutely careful that all of that tissue is removed from the woman, or it will cause a potentially deadly infection. So they'll wait till about 7 weeks so they can kind of recognize the form of what they're dealing with. It's interesting because you just saw an image of the product of abortion after 7 weeks, and what do you see? You saw two hands, didn't you? They were two severed hands, and because the skin was translucent, you were able to look through and count 10 tiny fingers. The bones were actually visible at 7 weeks. And that's important because when someone comes along and they say, well, it's my body, my choice, it allows us to do something that's very effective. If you want to deal with an emotional issue and you want to get to the heart of the issue and you want to make sure it doesn't escalate, you need to start asking questions. Instead of making accusations against someone, you start to ask questions. And we are able to ask some very interesting questions here. Does a pregnant woman have 4 hands? Does she have 20 fingers? And it becomes evident looking at the basic scientific facts that we are not dealing with one body. We're dealing with more than one body, definitely. And here's what's important as well. Ultrasound technology has been very effective in shaping the opinions of this new generation. By the way, young people are certainly these days a lot more pro-life than my generation. And we have all these arguments all the time about what are we going to call this generation, and some of the names I guess I can't repeat, but I like to refer to this generation as Generation U, Generation Ultrasound. This is the first generation that grew up with ultrasound technology and can't be fooled about what the unborn are. And it's really interesting when you get to the issue of development at that very early stage. You know, you hear some controversy about this, and you hear some different statistics that are quoted concerning when you can actually detect a heartbeat. Some sources will say after 21 days. Other sources will say after 23 days. Other sources will say after 28 days. Let me give some advice to pro-lifers here this evening. Whenever there is a factual dispute like that, err on the side of being conservative and just say that they can detect a heart at 28 days. Because that's very significant, isn't it? If the doctor will not perform that abortion until 7 weeks, what does that tell you? Each and every single time a surgical abortion is performed, it stops a beating heart. And by the way, I don't want there to be any confusion at all about what I'm arguing. I am not suggesting that life begins with a detectable heartbeat. I believe that it starts at conception. But my reason for reminding people of that heart is that it demonstrates that the thing that you're dealing with in abortion, the entity that you're dealing with, is not a clump of cells. It is a living being actively involved in the process of developing itself from within. That is precisely what that heart is doing. And so what you find is that when someone comes forth with a very emotional argument like that, you turn around and you give them that information, that doesn't mean that that's the end of the emotion in the debate. If you've argued this issue over and over, maybe on Facebook or actually in reality perhaps, in real actual relationships with people, you realize that sometimes folks will jump from one emotional issue to the next. And I think it's very important to stay focused on the central issue in the debate, because I think those arguments continue to make the same mistake over and over again. And let me give you an example of another emotional argument. That's the issue of back alley abortions. If you're a pro-life apologist, you can't get into too many of these conversations for very long without hearing that issue. My goodness, before Roe versus Wade, we had all of these individuals, these women who were dying because of unsafe abortions. They were dying in the back alleys by the thousands. And here is one of the principal mistakes that is made by people on my side of the debate. They get in these endless arguments about exactly what the number is. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that there's controversy about how many women died as a result of unsafe abortions back in the 1960s and before. And I think we can all agree that every single time that happened, that was a tragedy. But some of the numbers are just inaccurate. I think if you look at the Department of Health and Human Services from the year 1972, the last year that abortion was illegal in the United States of America across the board, essentially, the statistics actually say that only 39 women died as a result of unsafe abortions. I don't consider that statistic to be credible at all. But I don't consider the statistic that thousands of women died as a result of unsafe abortions to be credible either. The reason why is that figure was invented by Bernard Nathanson when he was the co-founder of NARAL. And he later on converted to Catholicism. I'm not Catholic, but I'm told when you convert to Catholicism, there's this thing called confession that you have to go through. And he stepped forward and he said, I just made up the number. It was simply propaganda. But here's what I want all of you to do. Those of you who are on my side is, look, I want you to just go with it. If someone says thousands of women died as a result of illegal abortions in the 1960s, go with it, because that's not the issue. The exact number is not the issue, because when someone brings that up, they're begging the question, essentially. Think about it for just a second. You would never make a claim to do a thing that is immoral in a safe and sanitary environment, would you? I mean, my students know that one of my dreams is to rob the Wachovia across the street. Actually, now it's the Wells Fargo, because it would be, okay, some of you understand that joke. It would be so easy to go commit an armed robbery right in between classes and then run across the street and kind of maybe wear a backpack and just blend in with everyone. I'm kidding, I'm not going to rob that bank. You know something? Wouldn't it be crazy if I were to call them beforehand and say, well, you know what? I've noticed that there's some mold and some fungus on the front sidewalk, and I'm concerned that I actually might get hurt in the process of robbing the bank, okay? No one would ever make the argument you have a right to do an immoral thing in a safe and sanitary fashion. It is begging the question, and if you take a look at the statistics, there's something really interesting that pops up that I want you to take in consideration right along with that number of thousands of unsafe abortions taking place in the 1960s. I want you to look at the number of abortions that take place and put that alongside the allegations about the number of women who died from unsafe abortions. If you take a look at the statistics from the decade or so before Roe versus Wade, you see that approximately 100,000 abortions took place despite the fact that it was against the law. Now, this is extremely important, okay? Assume that in the 1960s that thousands of women were dying as a result of these unsafe abortions, okay? Just assume that. And assume that as long as abortion is legal, you're saving those thousands of lives. Have any of you ever taken a look at the incidence of abortion after Roe versus Wade? we had approximately 100,000 abortions taking place in the 1960s on average. And then in 1973, it jumps up. Within a couple of years, we are up to over 1 million abortions taking place in the United States of America. Within 5 years, we are up to 1.5 million abortions taking place in the United States of America. And the peak occurs in the early 1990s with 1.6 million abortions taking place. I want you to think about those numbers for just a second, because when a person makes the back alley argument, they are saying that abortion saves thousands of lives. Guess what? We had a 1.5 million net increase in abortion per year after Roe versus Wade. Think about it for a second. Would you ever sacrifice millions of lives to save thousands? No. You might sacrifice thousands to save millions. The only way that the pro-choice position gets that argument to work is they look at the year 1991 and they say, we saved thousands of lives because these women weren't dying in back alleys, but we didn't lose any because that net increase of 1.5 million really isn't 1.5 million. It's zero. Why? Because the unborn are not human. Do you understand that you have to simply assume that they're not human? That is the only way that the math works. Now, when you hear various arguments in support of the pro-choice position, you find that they repeat this error over and over and over again. Pro-lifers in this room, how many of you have heard a person say, it would be absolutely unacceptable for us to force a woman to bring an unwanted child into the world? How many of you have heard that argument before? And again, that's an emotional argument as well. And I've noticed something interesting. People from the pro-life position often will hear that argument and they'll focus on that word force, and they'll say something like this: well, it's really not true that we're forcing the woman to do anything. We're really not doing that. We're trying to remove force from the unborn child. Okay, I get it, and I think that that's a sound argument, but you know what the key word in that argument is? The key word is unwanted. I don't believe there is such a thing as an unwanted child, because in those years when we had 1.5 million abortions taking place in the United States of America routinely, we had 1.5 million couples waiting in line to have an adoption, and were unable to do so because the children were in fact being aborted. So I don't accept that. But you see the subtle insinuation. When someone says it would be a tragedy to bring an unwanted child into the world, what they are suggesting is that child might be what? That child might actually be subject to child abuse or neglect. And I think that's really something. I mean, to come along and to say that we need abortion to stop child abuse is the most flagrant example of begging the question that I can imagine. It is assuming that abortion isn't child abuse simply because you're assuming that that's not a child. You would never say that we need to decapitate someone to prevent tooth decay, ladies and gentlemen. That is a classic example of begging the question. But in addition to the enormous logical error, there is a huge statistical problem as well. You go back to the year 1973 and look at the statistics from the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's fascinating. For that year, there were 167,000 reported instances of child abuse in the United States of America. 9 years after that, in the year 1982, there were 929,000 reported instances of child abuse in the United States of America. That is an increase of 556% in just 9 years. And when you look at those dramatic numbers, some people will ask me, what's your opinion on what caused that? And you know me, I always keep my opinion to myself. But actually, I'd like to respond and say, why are you surprised by that? Have you read Roe versus Wade? Roe versus Wade says that a woman has just an unfettered right to an abortion in the first trimester. and in the second trimester as well. But then all of a sudden, things change in the third trimester. The Supreme Court said, at that point, the unborn become viable. We'll talk about that argument in just a minute. But the unborn become viable, and then what does that mean? That means suddenly the state has an interest in protecting the child. However, the thing that is absolutely unknown to most people who are arguing in this debate is that the very same day that Roe versus Wade was handed down, Doe versus Bolton was handed down. Roe had said that the state not must, but may prevent the abortion during the third trimester unless there is some sort of a health interest on the woman's behalf. And what do you think? When you think about a late-term abortion and you think about the issue of health, you think, it must be something very serious that would trump the state interest if they said that the child is viable. No. In Doe versus Bolton, it said that we hereby define health as including socioeconomic health, familial health, physical health, psychological health, and emotional health. What does that mean? That means if a woman says, having that child will cause me stress, then that means she can trump the state interest in preventing that abortion during the third trimester. And so that's a point that I often bring up with people. Are you surprised? A woman has a constitutional right to kill the child if the child will simply cause her psychological distress. You have a constitutional right just to wipe people out who are in your way. Are you surprised by the fact that there is this massive increase in child abuse in the decade after Roe versus Wade? And the responses that I hear from pro-choicers are twofold. They say, one thing, you've got to realize that government reporting got better. That just kills me. Your students, if you are a student of mine, and you ever say that the federal government has the capacity to become 556% more efficient in doing something in less than a decade, I will sentence you to detention hall on a Saturday at the Department of Motor Vehicles, so you can see just how efficient that the government is. And then you say that and people are going, whoa, wrong argument. And then you'll hear this from other folks. They'll say, it's true, though, that there has been an increase in awareness of child abuse. Really? There was a 556% increase of knowledge that abusing a child is wrong between 1973 and 1982. I say, I don't care what the interpretation of the statistics is. Here's what I care about. If you're arguing to me that abortion is necessary to keep child abuse levels low, the numbers do not support that position at all. I don't mean to sound young and hip, but that is an epic fail, is what you would say on Facebook, probably. Okay? That argument doesn't work. I want to suggest to you this evening that when we take a look at all of the different arguments from the pro-choice position, you'll obviously hear me criticize them because I disagree with them. But I don't believe that all of the pro-choice arguments are created equal. There are a couple that are extremely bad, and then one that is much more difficult that we'll deal with in a little while. A couple of the really bad arguments that I hear is the poverty argument. This one, I've got to be honest with you, when I hear this one, I just hope that someone will just please say this to me on Facebook so that other people will be around, because it is so callous. I think your heart's hard if you make this argument, but if people hear you make this argument, they'll realize they don't want to be on your side when you make this argument. The poverty argument is indeed a very calloused one, I think. And what's interesting is that people, when they present this argument, often will do so in the form of hypotheticals. And those of you who are my students know that I can't imagine a world without hypotheticals. As a matter of fact, that would just be another hypothetical, wouldn't it? Okay, think about it. But I use hypotheticals all the time in my criminal law classes. And some people will approach me and say, I want you to imagine a situation where you have a woman. She has 5 children. And she's got these 5 children. She's got this bum of a husband. And all of a sudden, she becomes pregnant with the 6th child. And the guy who's just a bum, he takes off. He can't handle it. And there she is. She's got these 5 children to raise. and all of a sudden her husband is left, and she's dealing with these dire circumstances, and the poverty that she's experiencing will be exacerbated if this child is born. So in situations like that, I mean, isn't the humane thing to do to have the abortion? And my response is always very simple. I say, no, I've got a better idea. Don't abort the child. Kill the oldest kid. And those of you who gasp, thank you, because I'm not serious. I'm trying to get people to think about the central issue in the debate, confront them, and say, hey, hold on a second. You're saying that it's justified for economic circumstances, right? Well, Doe versus Bolton said that's a health issue, familial health. That counts. Do you really want to do that? Because think about it, the oldest child, that child eats more. That child is closer to college. That child's about to get a car. That child is closer to getting married. That child is more expensive. Kill that child. And they say, no, that's different. And I say, aha. What are you doing? You're simply assuming the unborn are not human. You've begged the question and you haven't dealt with the science. The fact of the matter is that they're both human. And that can allow us to begin to advance the argument. But other people will turn around and give a variation of that hypothetical. The variation of the hypothetical is like that. You have a poor woman. And the poor woman, she's in high school and she's about to graduate and she's just been accepted to East Carolina or maybe a good university like UNCW. That was the most controversial statement of the evening, okay? I'm not getting into Carolina versus Duke, okay? But at any rate, here's the deal. This woman has a bright future, but all of a sudden she has this unexpected pregnancy. And you know, if that child is born at that point, that child will be born into poverty. And boy, I love responding to people by saying, you know, I've got a book recommendation. And my students know this. I can't even have a conversation with you without offering a book. Oh, there's a great book that you need to read. Well, here's a book that you need to read. It's really short. It's only 50 pages long. It's called A Modest Proposal. And it was written by Jonathan Swift back in the 18th century. And he said, you know what? The problem of child poverty in Britain needs to be resolved by us killing children. And you know what they need to do is just kill the children, eat them, make lampshades out of their skin. I think Adolf Hitler read A Modest Proposal. It's just sick. And he wrote the thing, and then people thought he was serious because I guess that some people are not swift enough to understand satire. So he had to turn around after that and actually publish a statement in the newspaper saying it was just a satire. And I love confronting people who make the poverty argument and say, Jonathan Swift was kidding, but you're serious. And they turn around and they say, no, I don't want to kill children. I think they should be aborted before they're children. And then you say, aha, that's the central issue in the debate. What are the unborn? You can't assume that the unborn are not human and ignore the science of embryology and get away with it. You got to confront the central issue. And that's why I praise the Lord when they make that argument in public. It looks bad, but you know what? Even though it looks worse than the others, you notice that in essence, it's the same flaw of begging the question on the central issue of what are the unborn. And then the handicap issue. Oh my goodness, I hear this from folks, and pro-choicers, I recognize there are folks in this room who disagree with me. I'm going to do you a favor. Don't make this argument in public. This is a bad argument. When people say, oh, you know, but we might find out that a child has Down syndrome or that a child has cerebral palsy. And you know, under those circumstances, you can't expect the parent to have a child like that. That's a justification for abortion. I was having an argument with one of my friends one time, and I said, yeah, those people with cerebral palsy, you know, you ought to just take them to the Grand Canyon, show them the view, and just push them over the edge after a few minutes, because the handicapped life is not worth living. The way that we should deal with handicaps and get rid of handicaps, just kill the handicap. They're like, that is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you should kill a handicapped person. I'm saying that you should abort them before they become whoops. You've got a huge problem when it comes to handicaps, because what did I tell you about the beating heart? We can detect that beating heart at 4 weeks, can't we? You can't detect something like cerebral palsy or Down syndrome until the second trimester. And guess what? There's detection. There is not yet confirmation. And so what do you know? That's a human being actively involved in the process of developing itself from within long before you know that they've got a handicap and are therefore dispensable. But you know what? There's another issue that's serious. Error. I will never forget when I was speaking at Summit Ministries, my home in the summer in Colorado. I love it. My students get tired of me talking about it. But I love it. It's my home, and I teach at this ministry in the summer, and it's wonderful. And I gave this lecture one time. 19-year-old African-American man comes walking up to me after the lecture. Good-looking guy, athletic guy, and he was beating the stew out of our staff on the volleyball court, which is hard to do because we hire people on the basis of volleyball skills. This guy was extremely athletic, and he walked up to me and he says, I just wanted to introduce myself. He says, I have cerebral palsy. I said, no, you don't. He said, you're right. But the first 3 doctors said that I did. And the 4th doctor was a Christian. And something about the conscience of my mother listened to that 4th doctor and decided to give me a chance to live. And he just said, thank you for bringing up that issue. Man, you know what? Those are rough, calloused arguments. It's better to be dead than to be handicapped. It's better to be dead than to be poor. Those are bad arguments. I wish all of the arguments were that bad. But they're not. There's some tough ones out there. They're very, very tough. And I will never stand before you and lie about the changes that I've gone through in my outlook on the issue of abortion. When I saw a silent scream and I converted to the pro-life position and I decided I'd made a mistake on the central issue. It's not a blob of tissue. I became pro-life, but not really pro-life, not fully. I supported that rape exception because it was just common sense to me. I mean, I sat there and I just thought to myself, who could possibly think that a woman who is impregnated as a result of a rape didn't choose to become pregnant? How could you possibly suggest that that woman has got to carry that child to term and give it up for adoption? It would only make sense that the woman make an effort to assuage the unbelievably painful circumstance of the conception by having the abortion. It'll help her forget about the rape, right? I mean, it was common sense to me. And then something transformational happened in my life. It's really interesting how people just kind of fall in my path all the time and in just great ways that just influence my thinking and cause me to realize, man, God, I was wrong about that thing. It's still happening, by the way. Okay, it is still happening. I thought Carolina was going to win the national championship in basketball this year. Duke fans, I don't want to hear it. NC State fans, I really don't want to hear it this week. But I'll tell you something really interesting happened. I wish I could remember the exact year. And I apologize that I don't remember. It was around the year 2001. I had been pro-life for a few years. And at that point, I'm dating a woman who I would eventually marry, and we were just having this discussion, and she had a good friend who we'll call Laura, because that's her name. And they grew up together. And she always knew that she'd been adopted, but she didn't know the circumstances of her adoption. And so then she made a decision that she was going to investigate those circumstances. And she found out that her birth mother, had been raped while she was just a teenager. That she was conceived and raped. And she not only found out the circumstances of her conception, but she also was able to locate her birth mother. And so Laura finds this out, tells Kristen, and then Kristen comes home and tells me about this. And she says, man, I mean, this is just such a shocker and everything. And she says, you know what? You know, it's like, now that I think about it, Kristen said, I don't support abortion in the context of rape. And I said, what are you talking about? She says, I don't support the rape exception. And she said, it wouldn't be right to kill Laura because she's made contact with her birth mother and her continued existence reminds her mother of that painful event. She said, that wouldn't be right. And then I said, of course it wouldn't be right to kill her now. And she goes, oh, well, what's the difference between the adult she is now and the unborn child that she once was that would have justified killing her at that earlier stage of development? I was destroyed because I had no argument whatsoever. And Kristen looks at me and she says it would have been worse because I never would have known her. And I'm just devastated because I have no answer. Have you ever seen me speechless before? Some of you are like, I wish he'd finish the speech so I could see him speechless, but I really was speechless that day. And I just couldn't get over that because it really got to the central issue. And that's what helped me change my mind. And I want us to think about it for a second, because I am certainly by no stretch of the imagination here this evening to defend the status quo, because I think that the status quo is extremely ugly with regard to the issue of rape. And I'd like to talk about it for just a second. Okay? By the way, there are people out there who are often criticized, who are pro-lifers, who might support the death penalty. And a lot of people will approach them and they'll say, oh, you're inconsistent because you're applying a double standard because you support the death penalty, but you oppose abortion. Let me address that real quickly by telling you what a double standard is. A double standard is when you apply two different standards to the same thing. An unborn child and a convicted criminal are not the same thing. I want to get that out of the way because I'm going to bring up the issue of our death penalty jurisprudence. In the year 1977 in Coker versus Georgia, there was a horrific case where a man had raped a teenager. She was an adult, technically, and it was technically speaking not a statutory, but it was actually a common law rape charge. This man had a very long rap sheet, and the state of Georgia attempted to execute him. And they were disallowed from doing that in 1977. The U.S. Supreme Court said that it would be disproportionately cruel and unusual punishment to execute someone for rape. You should only execute someone for murder, essentially. But one of the fascinating things about Coker versus Georgia is that it left open a very narrow question. And that narrow question, you go back and read the decision, and the Supreme Court says this. They say we might have a different case before us if we were dealing with an extraordinary rape, such as an aggravated rape of a child. Well, along comes the case of Kennedy versus Louisiana, which was handed down by the United States Supreme Court on June 30th of 2008. It involved it involved a male, I refuse to refer to him as a man, by the name of Kennedy, who lived in Louisiana, obviously. And this individual had a stepdaughter. And between the ages of 6 and 8, his stepdaughter was raped and sodomized and tortured by him. And it was always brutal when it happened. But then on one afternoon, for whatever particular reason, it escalates. And he so brutally rapes and sodomizes that 8-year-old girl that he just tears open her insides, basically. I mean, the wall of her vagina is torn, her bowels are just torn open. And they have to take this woman as she is bleeding to death. He's got to call 911, and they've got to take this little child and take this child to the emergency room and put her on an operating table for 2 hours just to save her. And they barely save her life. And he concocts this crazy story where he says that some kids in the neighborhood did it. Well, guess what? The blood evidence finds him out. There's blood in the garage on the premises. And so what do? They get this guy, they try him, they convict him, and they sentence him to die. And he says, oh no, that would be disproportionately cruel and unusual punishment. I'm appealing this case to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans. So they do. It's New Orleans. And you know what they say? You're going to die. He then decides, it's too close to Texas for the result to be different, right? The fact of the matter is that the case is appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And in a 5-4 decision, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision authored by Justice Anthony Kennedy, no relation. You know who Kennedy is. You got 4 liberals, you got 4 conservatives, and Kennedy, who's 76 and is trying to figure out what he's going to be when he grows up. And he is all over the place. And he is the most powerful man in America because of it. He's the swing vote. No, Barack Obama is number 2. I'm sorry. The fact of the matter is that Kennedy wields an enormous amount of power. And in that decision, he decided to become a part of a 5-4 majority that said it is disproportionately cruel and unusual punishment to execute Kennedy. Under no circumstances whatsoever may you execute a rapist who only committed a rape. No, they have to kill them as well. It's incredible, isn't it? That's the status quo. I have not come here to defend the status quo. Because what does the status quo say? Status quo says that the rapist has a constitutional right to life. The woman has a constitutional right to choose. The unborn child has absolutely nothing. You can defend that if you like. I'm not going to join you because I think it's profane. I think it's deeply immoral. I'll never forget a few years ago. I'm walking across the campus at NC State University, and there is this crazy pastor out there just yelling. And I hear all this noise, and I think, Brother Ross. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Brother Ross is not here. We'll know it in just a second if he is. But I'm walking across the campus, and this campus pastor, he's just yelling. And I'm just thinking, oh, crazy campus pastor. And I'm trying to walk by, and then all of a sudden he turns and he goes, hey, it's Mike Adams. And I'm like, oh my goodness, the crazy campus pastor knows me. And he goes, Mike Adams, come on over here. I read your column all the time. I'm like, oh no, the crazy campus pastor is a fan of mine. And I go walking over there, and I'm like, my goodness, what is all this commotion about? And they're having this argument. It's the campus pastor having an argument with a woman. He turns to me, and he says, this woman, you know what she believes? She believes that when a woman is raped and she becomes pregnant, that she has a right to kill a human being just to help her forget about the rape. Do you agree with that? And I looked at this pastor and I said, I absolutely agree with her and not you. And he wished at that point that he didn't call me over there. Because I looked and I said, I think she's got every right to kill the rapist. And I turned around and I walked off. After a pause, there was thunderous applause, ladies and gentlemen. And I guess for once I actually brought people together. And then I just kind of moved on. It's kind of interesting because I want you to think about that for just a second. What they were arguing about. You see, the idea is that the woman is raped, she becomes impregnated, that's a problem, and the solution is the abortion. The idea is that if she has the abortion, then she will forget about it. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got news for you. When a woman is raped, she will never forget about it. And I will tell you this, sometimes it is better to suffer evil than to inflict it. And here's what I believe. We have a flaw in our thinking in this country. And it causes all kinds of problems like big government and so on and so forth. That we always think there's a problem and a solution. As I get older, and I am old, ladies and gentlemen, I just turned 50. Those of you who are over 50, you're not old, but I am. I've had a little rougher life, probably. But you know what? As I get older, I realize this. We do not live in a world that's characterized by problems and solutions. We live in a world that's characterized by trade-offs. And here's the situation. Pro-lifers, you better understand this right now. That argument that's made for the rape exception, that's not the handicap argument. That's not the poverty argument. It's a tough argument. And you better understand this. If it is our position that it's not justifiable to kill an innocent human being for the crime of another person, you've got to realize you're imposing in a big way on a rape victim. If you are saying she must carry that child to term and then give that child up for adoption, that's a big thing that you're imposing. But you know what? If you go the other way on the issue, what are you doing? You're executing, in fact, dismembering an innocent human being for the crime of another while the rapist has a right to life. You see, that's what changed my mind, is that analysis. But I recognize that that's a tough question. But you know what I really respect about my then girlfriend who just hit me with that statement about Laura? she got down to the central issue. She says, you really need to justify what's the difference between the adult that Aura is today and the unborn child that she once was that would have justified killing her at that earlier stage of development. And this leads us to the second major part of the argument. You see, if you're a pro-lifer, here's what you have to do. You have to use the science of embryology to establish that the unborn are human. You don't use Bible scripture. You're not going to relate to people on the other side by doing that. You use the science of embryology. But you're not done. Because so many people, when you go through that, you point out the question-begging nature of the argument, they will sit there and they will say, well, you know what? I accept that the unborn are human, but there's a difference between a human being and a person. And this is an argument that you get into all the time. Now, by the way, I want to be clear about this. I do not accept that there's a difference between a human being and a person. I believe that that is an evasion. But you're going to run into that argument. And you see, when you run into that argument, science is not going to get you through it. Philosophy is going to get you through it. Because when a person makes an argument that, okay, I accept that the unborn are human, but they're different from us, and they're different in some way that justifies killing them at that earlier stage of development, you have to understand that the argument will take one of four forms. And this is brilliant, so you know that I didn't think of it. It was Stephen Schwartz who came up with a brilliant acronym. It's known as the SLED acronym. He says that when people try and say that there's a difference, they point to one of four differences: size, level of development, environment, which is whether the child is inside the womb or outside of the womb, and then degree of dependency. That's the SLED acronym. And you have to address those differences. And I think if we stop and we think about them logically, and we rely upon philosophy, we realize that none of those differences between the adult that you are today and the unborn child that you once were is morally relevant such that it would justify killing you at an earlier stage of development. Because actually they're very dangerous ideas. You begin with the issue of size. Think about it for just a second. Men are larger than women on average. Are we to suggest, because men are larger than women, that they have a greater right to life than a woman does? The very idea that our size determines our human worth undermines human equality. And this is the problem that you get into. If you're going to defend abortion by saying, oh, okay, I admit you're right, the unborn are human, but there's something different about them. You have a choice. Pro-choicers, you have a choice. You have to choose between abortion and human equality, and you can't have both. That's the decision that you're faced with, and that's the reason why we've titled the lecture, Abortion and Human Equality. Because size isn't relevant to your worth as a human being. You think about level of development for just a second. My goodness, are you kidding me? Are we really going to suggest, you look at a 2-year-old child. Let's look at a woman for a second. A 2-year-old girl. This girl, she's just beginning to utter her first words. She can't put together a complete sentence, and she can't read or write yet. And you look at her and you compare her with a 22-year-old woman who has a college degree, unless she went to ECU, of course, and it might take her a few extra years, but I'm not going to pick on ECU that much. Think about it. She has a fully developed reproductive system. She's not only larger, but she has all of these skills. She might speak a foreign language. She might have a college degree. She's more developed. Are we really going to suggest that underdevelopment is a justification for killing people? If you dropped a nuclear bomb on New York City and then you turned around and you dropped one in South America somewhere and you killed 1 million people in both cases, would you really make the argument that one of those was less a crime than the other because it was an underdeveloped nation with people who were less literate, less educated? No, you can't make that argument without doing what? Undermining human equality. Your choice is between abortion and human equality. So you look at it. That's the L, level of development. Now, E, environment. Let's imagine for just a second a hypothetical, because I can't get through a lecture without using some hypotheticals. Imagine for just a moment that you have a pair of twins. These women are 30 years old. And one of them lives in New York City. The other one lives in Los Angeles, and they've been married for a few years, and they're excited about having their first child. And then all of a sudden, the sister from New York City calls the sister in Los Angeles and says, "You're not going to believe this. I'm pregnant. I'm going to have my first child." And the sister in Los Angeles responds, "Oh, what a coincidence. I'm pregnant as well." And they're going through their pregnancies. And I want you to imagine for just a moment that the woman in Los Angeles has her child prematurely. She has this child at 7 months, and then the sister in New York flies out to visit her. Goes out to visit her and sees this child, and the child's not doing that well because there were some health concerns and is a little bit weak and is a real handful. And that sister goes back home to New York City, and she is in her 3rd trimester, and suddenly she becomes very psychologically stressed out about the prospect of being a mother. And she then uses that under Doe versus Bolton to secure a 3rd trimester abortion. Think about that for just a second. What exactly is the difference between that baby in New York City and that baby in Los Angeles? They're the same size. They're the same level of development. One of them traveled 8 inches down the birth canal and got out and got a right to life. My question is this: since when did traveling 8 inches change your status as a person? How does where you are determine what you are? I would suggest to you that that's not morally relevant. In fact, it's dangerous. Now, I want us to move to the last part of the SLED acronym, which is degree of dependency. And this is one that we have to take seriously because it's going to come up. I will never forget when I was giving a speech back in March of 2012. I'm at Clarion University in Pennsylvania, and this woman hits me with a question in the Q&A, and I welcome difficult questions. I just think they're good for us all. I really do. This woman is about 5 months pregnant. And she asked me a question during the Q&A. She says, "If I have a baby and that baby can't survive without me and is dependent upon me, how can you argue that that baby has a right to life? That baby is connected to me and dependent upon me." And so those of you who have had my classes, once again, you know hypotheticals. I'm always searching for that hypothetical. And I said, I want you to imagine I'm in a gang. Really unbelievable hypothetical. But I said, I want you to imagine that someone in my gang has been shot and killed. And I decide that I'm going to go exact revenge. And I go to the home of this rival gang member, and I go through and I drive by, and I've got my Uzi, and I start firing shots. And I fire shots into the wrong room. And this gang member has twin sisters. They're Siamese twins. And I gunned them both down. I said, "How many degrees of homicide have I committed?" She said, 2, of course. I said, "No, 0. You see, you just made the argument that if a human being is attached to another and dependent upon them for survival, they're actually not a human being." And she stopped for a second and she thought about it. I said, "We know that that's 2 human beings. It's not morally relevant." And you know what? It's important that we talk about this because the issue of viability that I said that came up in Roe versus Wade, that issue of viability is written into that important constitutional decision, and that is a measure of dependency. We need to think about that issue for just a second, and I want to examine it once again with another hypothetical where we go back to New York City, and you imagine that you have a woman, and this woman is living in New York City, and she is 22 weeks pregnant. We now have a case of a child surviving outside of the womb at 21 weeks. So technically speaking, that child could survive with the best health care potentially outside of the womb. So she's there in New York City. And you've said that viability makes you a person. So she's got a little person inside of her womb. So then she makes a decision to go for 10 weeks, and she's going to get involved in a mission trip. And she's going to travel to South America, or she's going to travel to sub-Saharan Africa for 10 weeks between the 22nd week and the 32nd week of pregnancy. She goes over there into a third world nation where they are unable to support a child outside of the womb until 35 weeks. Are you going to argue that that little baby was a person in New York City and then became a non-person in Chile or in Zimbabwe or some foreign country, and when that mission work was over and that child was flown back to New York City, it suddenly became a person again? You see, that's known as the episodic problem. You see, because some of these little differences can create situations where we have human beings popping in and out of existence. And it just doesn't work. And what does it demonstrate? Here's what it shows. Viability is not a measure of personhood. Viability is not a measure of humanity. Viability is a measure of technology. And do you think that you become a person in New York City before you become a person in Africa? If that's your argument, you are undermining human equality. And once again, you've got a choice. You're going to support abortion, or are you going to support human equality? You see, here's the deal, ladies and gentlemen. We can't just dive into this debate and take a position without stopping and thinking about the central issue in the debate. I am 50 years old and going through a horrific midlife crisis right now. And I'm thinking about starting a band. I used to be a musician. I'm thinking about starting a band. I will call it midlife crisis, by the way. And I'm starting to have dreams of high school when I had my first car. Apparently my dad wanted to kill me because he bought me a 1970 GTO, which went 155 miles an hour. How do I know? Forget about it. I have these dreams of getting a 1965 GTO, and they're recurrent. And I want you to imagine that I am in my garage, and think about this thought experiment for just a second. I'm standing there and I've got the hood of that GTO, it's open, and I'm looking at that 389 motor with the 3.2 barrel carburetors, and I'm just thinking about all that I'm going to do as I look under the hood. And then all of a sudden I hear this little voice behind me, and it is my 5-year-old nephew. And he comes walking up behind me, and he says, Uncle Mike, can I kill it? Now, before I would answer that question, there's a predicate question that I need to ask. What is the thing that you have? If I turn around and I see that the child has got a cockroach, I will strongly encourage the child to kill the cockroach and wash his hands very thoroughly. If he has a snake, I am terrified of snakes. I will strongly encourage him to kill the snake. But if I turn around and I see that he has his 2-year-old little brother in a headlock, I will not encourage him to kill his 2-year-old brother. I will ask him to seek counseling. You don't ever answer the question of whether we can kill something until we get to the issue of what it is. And that's what you have to consider. And if you think about the science and you think about the philosophy, what do you realize? There is no difference between the adult that you are today and the unborn child that you once were that would have justified killing you at that earlier stage of development. That's the thesis that I'm presenting to you tonight. Why is it difficult for some people? I think it's difficult for some people because we confuse construction with development. And we just don't realize how people come to be, essentially. And I kind of want to close here with a hypothetical, which involves another midlife crisis issue. On the 14th of May, I will have the tremendous privilege of going to Oregon State University and debating Nadine Strawson on the issue of abortion, the former president of the ACLU. I can't wait to tell her I used to be one of them, and I turned on them. And we'll have a good debate, I'm sure. But after that debate is over, and they cut me my check because I did convert to capitalism, I can assure you, I am going to get in my car and I'm going to drive down to Northern California. And I'm going to take that $2,000 and I'm going directly to the Mesa Boogie Factory, which makes the greatest guitar amplifiers in the United States of America. And they give you tours. And I'm going to be able to walk in there. And I'm going to be able to see them put together an amplifier. And it's going to be really interesting because the first thing they're going to do is they're going to take two pieces of birch and they're going to bolt them together. And no one in their right mind is going to say that that's an amplifier. Then what are they going to do? A couple more pieces of birch? Then the speaker's going to be bolted in. At that point, do you have an amplifier? No. Then they're going to go and they're going to cover the outside and they're going to put in the grill. At that point, do you have an amplifier? No. You need a volume knob. And my volume knob will go to 11 because 10 is not enough, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to go to 11. And they'll put that in. Will we have an amplifier? Well, I don't know. We need an input jack. At some point, it will be sufficiently constructed where we will arrive at a consensus that the thing we're dealing with is an amplifier. But that isn't the way that you and I were put together. How were we put together? We're going to deal with all the old folks in this room who know what a Polaroid camera is. And I will never forget my first trip to the Grand Canyon in 1973. I was just a 9-year-old kid. What did I say, a 2-year-old kid? Okay, a 9-year-old kid. And I will never forget going to the South Rim, to Grandview Point, and standing there and having our family's first Polaroid camera and taking a picture. And I remember taking a picture on the South Rim. And as that thing began to develop, what do you see? You see just a little tiny dot. What if my brother, who's 6 years older than I, were to come over and just grab a hold of that Polaroid picture and just rip it up and tear it to shreds and throw it away? Would I be rightly angry and justified under those circumstances to say that an injustice had taken place? Absolutely. Because you look at it, it's awfully small. It's not real beautiful at first. But you know what? That picture is in the process of developing itself from within. It's becoming larger, it's becoming more complex, and it's becoming more beautiful. And if you just wait, you see a beautiful result. And I'll tell you something, we have something in common in this room. We may have our differences. We may disagree about politics and religion and the issue that I'm talking about this evening, but we share something in common that makes us all valuable. It's our common human nature. It's our common human nature. In the Declaration of Independence, what does it say? It says we're created equal. We're endowed by our Creator with worth. We don't have to go and earn our personhood. It is given to us by our Creator. And inalienable means just that. It can't be taken away from us as a simple matter of convenience. And the other thing we've got in common, someone left us alone while we were actively involved in the process of developing ourselves from within. They didn't tear us up and throw us away. And I say that matters. And I say that's just. And I say that's the very thing that we owe to the unborn. That's my argument. I'll take your questions.
Okay, so I'm sure hopefully we have a lot of questions. I think we've got about 45 minutes. 30 to 45, 30 minutes to ask questions. If you have a question, what we'd like you to do is, if you can, queue up over here, and then we'll take the questions as we can, one at a time, versus trying to run around. And we want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions if they have any. So if you have a question, please line up over here. Emma is right here, and she would we can line up with her. We'll take maybe a minute before we get started. Okay, obviously if you have a question as we get started, certainly come down and get in line. But we will, and I will hold on to the mic, so don't try to wrestle the mic from me. I will hold on to it as we do the questions. So, all right, first question up.
I had a stillborn baby in 2005. I was pregnant at 16 weeks, and they told me that the baby most likely had trisomy 18, and they tried to convince me to have an abortion. And I said, no, I'm not going to have an abortion. And they sent me for a second opinion, and they told me that, yeah, the baby definitely has trisomy 18. And I'm like, well, I don't really believe you. And so we kept prolonging, keeping the pregnancy. And the whole time I have a strong faith, so I believed that the baby was going to be all right. I had somebody tell me at a church, I have a message from God. You and your baby are going to be okay. And so at, I guess, 37 weeks, I was using the clinic here at New Hanover. And every time I went to the doctor, I always was expecting something bad to happen. But this time when I went, I was only supposed to get the Rh negative shot because I'm Rh. I'm O negative and my husband is B positive. But they didn't give me the shot at the right time. They weren't on top of it. And so we were just going for this shot. And she did the shot, and then 20 minutes later she said, oh, let's just check your baby's heart rate. And then all of a sudden the baby's heart rate is dropping, and I got rushed over to the labor and delivery, and the baby's heartbeat stopped. And I felt like we killed the baby. I said, that shot killed the baby. And they're like, no, it's just a coincidence. And but in my heart, I really felt like that shot killed the baby. And the weird thing is that at the doctor's office, before anything happened, like when I first found out I was pregnant, I was at the high-risk doctor, and I was talking to I'm a Christian, another Christian in the doctor's office, and we were talking about how if they would just make it that if you have an abortion that you have to bury your dead baby, there'd be so many less abortions because nobody wants to spend the money to bury their dead child. Then this whole thing happens to me, and both of us end up having to bury our dead babies. And I was so afraid to get the results back when they told me we didn't have an autopsy because everybody believed that the baby had trisomy 18. But so I was really petrified. I didn't want to get the results back because in my heart I felt like they were going to tell me that the baby didn't have trisomy 18. And sure enough, I get the call from the genetic counselor, and she said, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but the baby didn't have any genetic disorder. Yeah. And it just crushed me, and it's 10 years later, and I'm still dealing with a lot of depression over it. And my question is, can we make a law that, you have to, that abortion facilities have to bury these children or in a humane way? Like I always, when my Joseph died, I thought I'm gonna work hard to do that, but I didn't. But I feel like we had a full funeral for him, and it ended up being like $8,000 to bury him respectfully. Is there any way that we can kind of go about it a different way and say abortion companies have to bury their dead baby, make it a law? Like,
actually, there's a few issues there that I'd like to deal with. And thank you for sharing. By the way, I appreciate that. First of all, on the issue of health exceptions generally, you've actually brought up something that we really didn't get into in my lecture. And one thing that I wanted to clarify is that I think we need to change the health exception law that we have. First of all, obviously, you can understand that I disagree with Roe versus Wade, and I'd like to see that overturned. And a lot of people talk about the issue of abortion, and they think, oh, it's something where we can't get the government involved in that because that's such a personal decision. Let's be very clear about one thing. No matter what we do on the issue of abortion, the government will be involved. The question that we have is whether the issue is going to be dictated by judicial fiat or whether it's going to be handled in the legislatures. Okay? And so then if Roe versus Wade were overturned, then we could begin to consider laws like that. I would prefer something like a mandatory ultrasound or something of that nature so that people would understand essentially what they're getting into and make a decision on the basis of full information. I would certainly demand that, at least as a first step, basically, for doing away with abortion. But I do believe that there is a need for a health exception. We need to understand that. For example, in the case of ectopic pregnancy, that gives us an example. If you don't know what ectopic pregnancy is, that's a situation where the child is actually not conceived and implanted in the womb. It's actually in the fallopian tube. And in a situation like that, as the baby grows, guess what's going to happen? The baby can't survive out there. And in addition to that, the fallopian tube is going to burst, and it's also going to kill the woman as well. So in circumstances like that, where we're confronted with a situation, we're either going to allow two to die, or we're going to remove the child. That's a circumstance where a health exception makes sense. A lot of people do bring up that issue of trisomy 13 or trisomy 18. I don't support abortion in those circumstances for the reasons that you mentioned. If we know that someone's not going to live long and that they're going to die soon, that doesn't mean that we can kill them sooner necessarily. I mean, we don't harvest the organs of people who are on death row, basically, and do experiments on them because we know that they're going to die soon. But the overriding issue that concerns me is this continuous, repetitive problem of misdiagnosis. I had a student out at Summit Ministries who approached me by the name of Raisa Penley, and she was 16 years old, and she walked up to me and she says, "I've got trisomy 18. Once again, I said, "No, you don't." She said, "Thank you." That was the diagnosis. Okay, so thank you for your story that helps us to bring clarity to the issue of the proper parameters of a health exception.
One more last comment. When I had the baby, when the baby we were in the hospital, when they had to have a police officer come and take the baby away from me to bring to the funeral, to give to the funeral director. It just worked.
Thanks for your input. Okay.
Excellent presentation, Dr. Adams. Two quick questions. One, for the women that ask you how you can talk about abortion since you cannot get pregnant, how do you answer that question? And then the second question is, do you consider the morning after pill chemical abortion?
Right. Okay. Two very important issues to talk about. How do I respond to that? Well, I often get that argument. People say that you should not be speaking out on the issue of abortion because you're a male. I simply argue that arguments don't have gender. They don't. Arguments do not have genitalia, ladies and gentlemen. They are arguments. And so if I get up here and I make an argument and someone says, "I don't like that argument because you're a man," where does that get us? I can just write the argument down and invite a woman up to the podium. She can read it, and then you still have to respond to it. That is an absolutely invalid argument that people make from time to time, and it's very sexist. What?
You may want the $2,000 for that.
Okay. Well, here's the deal as well. I would respond as well by saying this. If an individual says that a man's opinion on the issue of abortion is invalid, I say thank you very much. You just overturned Roe versus Wade because all 9 of the justices were males. Checkmate. The other one, the issue of the morning after pill, basically. When you hear me get up and speak on the issue of abortion, it's very important to make a distinction between RU486 and something like Plan B. Here's my view on this. First of all, I'm opposed to surgical abortion. I talked about ultrasounds a minute ago. I don't want anyone to be under the impression that I think, it's okay if she's had an ultrasound. No, I want to do away with surgical abortion, except for a situation where you have a life exception based upon ectopic pregnancy or uterine cancer or something of that nature. Okay, so I would like to do away with it. I also believe that we should do away with RU486 for a couple of reasons. First of all, RU486 is always abortifacient. The second, it always chemically, it essentially burns the unborn child. With the first pill, it just chemically burns it to death. And then the second thing it does is to induce labor falsely to expel it. That is an utterly cruel thing. And in addition to that, women who take RU486 very frequently have extreme bleeding and side effects as a result. So let's make absolutely certain that we understand there's a big difference between RU486 and something like Plan B. I would neither try to ban Plan B nor would I recommend it, okay? Because I'm not convinced that that's always abortifacient. For example, a woman is, in fact, a victim of a rape, and the next day she's concerned about that. I'm convinced that she can actually take Plan B to prevent conception. Having said that, okay, that I believe it can prevent conception and not implantation, which is different because that would technically be abortifacient. It's conceived but can't implant and dies. I would say this, while I don't oppose it in the sense of wanting to make it illegal, it's a dangerous thing, because what you're seeing on our college campuses that really bothers me, they're setting up vending machines. And they've got the morning after pill. And someone can go and pay $25 to get the morning after pill. And you know what's really happening? Is that people will sit there, and you know how it is when you're in college. People go out and they have good intentions, and it's like, well, I'm going to go out and drink a little bit, but not too much, and I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to make this bad decision. And then they go and they do what? Knowing that it's right there in the cafeteria. They go and they have unprotected sex, and then they say, oh, I'll just go in and pay my $25 at the vending machine, and I'll take it. And they start using that as regular birth control. And then it becomes very dangerous because you have clotting issues and things of that nature. I mean, it's an unnatural infusion of hormones that creates problems. So I don't recommend it, nor seek to legislatively ban it, because it's different from RU46. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Adams.
Yes.
I just thought of this because of the previous questioner was asking about his first question about how to respond to women who say that men shouldn't addressing this. And one thing that I usually tell them is, well, I was born in Mississippi in 1975, and I am a Roe versus Wade survivor. So I think that gives me enough reason to be able to talk about it and discuss it. The other question, or my original question actually, is concerning, I don't know, maybe correlations between the situation we live in now concerning abortion compared with that of the mid-19th century and before in the U.S. when we had slavery, and that was legal.
Right.
What do you think about the correlations between that? Is our society as evil as it was then? And
I think that every time throughout the course of human history where we've tried to say that there's a difference between a human being and a person, it has resulted in grave, grave immorality. And the issues that I'm talking about this evening were in fact issues during the slavery movement. And I'm going to paraphrase them and I'm going to butcher it and do a bad job with it. But when Abraham Lincoln was arguing with Senator Douglas, and they were having their debates and discussing what was the most important moral issue, obviously, of the middle of the 19th century, he said, you know what? As we take a look at the black man and the white man, and we try and say that there's a difference between them, that one is fully a person and the other isn't, on what basis do you decide that? Do you decide it's because of the color of their skin? If you look at a black man and you say that he's less of a person than you because of the shade of his skin, that automatically makes you a slave to the first person who comes along and has fairer skin than you. What if it's your perception that a black man is less intelligent than you, and you really believe that, and you say, therefore, he's less of a person than me? You have just enslaved yourself to the first person who comes along and has a higher IQ than you. What if you simply say that it is in my economic interest to enslave the black man, and therefore it's moral? Well, guess what? You've just enslaved yourself to the first person who can make it in his economic interest to place you in chains. We are dealing with exactly the same problem. It's known as gradualism. The idea that you're born as something less than a person and you have to prove it to someone and attain it. It is in direct conflict with our Declaration of Independence. And that's why I think abortion is wrong in a nutshell, for the same reason that slavery was wrong. Thank you.
Hi. Just wondering if you, it seems to me it's fairly obvious, but would you extend the same arguments you've based your case on tonight to euthanasia?
I'm sorry, to what?
To euthanasia.
To euthanasia? What do you mean by euthanasia exactly? Let me.
Well, mercy killing.
Mercy killing?
Ending a life.
I am not supportive of it. I just don't think that I have a right to do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Adams, first I'd just like to say thank you for traveling all the way from your office down here for us to speak tonight.
Hey, in this weather, it was really difficult.
You have a great point. I have two questions. First one's very short. Why do you prefer Mesa Boogie over a Marshall tube amp? Because when you put those tubes open and they scream, I think it's better than a Mesa Boogie, personally.
You've just offended me, by the way, but I'll answer it in just a second.
My second question tonight is referring, you have a PhD in criminology and sociology, so I guess I wanted to ask your opinion on the Donahue and Levitt, the study based on abortion rates and crime rates in certain areas.
Right.
And I suppose, I don't want to answer it in the sense of it's begging the question, more of the
Right.
sociology and the criminology aspect of it, as how abortion can affect criminal rates.
Yes, that is such a great question, and thank you so much. First of all, the reason why I like Mesa Boogie amplifiers is because I play Fender guitars, and it's got more of an American clean sound. I'm about to get a Gibson Les Paul. I will get a Marshall if it will satisfy you, because you can never have enough guitars and amplifiers. But regarding the issue of the relationship between abortion and crime, it's extremely important that we actually talk about this, because a few years ago, obviously, there was a book, Freakonomics, that came out, and it was read by everyone, and they had gone and they had done a study basically that suggested that the massive crime rate decrease that we had in the 1990s, those of you who aren't familiar with it, our crime rate went up by 100% in the 1960s, and then it went down by approximately 25% between the years 1993 and 2000. And what they did was a study to suggest that, well, that had something to do with abortion, because you've got all these kids who were going to grow up in disadvantaged environments, and poor women were disproportionately having these abortions, and so, they just didn't grow up to be criminals, basically. I would just suggest that there has been a response to that calls those results into question. A guy by the name of John Lott, who's most famous for writing More Guns, Less Crime, and he wrote about concealed weapons permits. He read the book, Freakonomics, and he was bothered by what he considered to be the systematic omission of certain control variables. And he said, I'd like to go analyze some of these problems, reanalyze them with other control variables involved. And what he found when he did that, he kind of jokingly called his book Freedomnomics, because he's kind of an Adam Smith kind of free market guy. And so what he did was to write this book, and he put in this chapter in which he threw in some other variables. One of those was incarceration rates. The fact that the federal government has gotten rid of parole, for example, and the number of police officers on the street, concealed weapons permits, economic factors. And when he threw in all of these control variables, he found out that the relationship changed just a little bit, and that the existence of abortion actually slightly exerted a slight increase in the crime rate. And his logic actually was fairly complicated. I would suggest you actually read the book, because it's just really fascinating, and it's good reading. But he said that the issue is that what happened is when abortion happened, basically we began to actually separate marriage from procreation, and it had larger effects on dating and sex outside of marriage. And he would argue that ultimately, as abortion went up, it also paradoxically was also increasing illegitimacy rates. And he argued that those fatherlessness rates were driving up every negative social indicator. So what I do on that issue is to do what I do on every issue, and to suggest that people read both sides. Start with Freakonomics, then read Freedomnomics, and make up your own mind. And it's interesting, I want to throw out a statistic. Remember that in the year 1991, we had our peak in abortions in the United States of America with 1.6 million. The next year, we had our peak in homicides with 25,000. And so I like to ask people, how many millions of abortions would we be willing to tolerate in order to get that number down to acceptable levels? It's worth thinking about. Thank you.
I do have one follow-up.
Yes, sure.
In 2007, there also was a follow-up study, and I can't remember the name of the study, but it also correlated abortion rates with in crime rates with population control. In a sense, the concept of abortion is population control, and it also affects crime rates. Not so much as the impoverished people, like crime rates going down, but as far as a population check, like crime rates and statistically relating.
Okay.
So I was wondering if that, you kind of answered the question halfway.
I'd like to read it. Email address is AdamsM, and if you find it, send me a link. I'd love to read it just to follow up and see if they've done anything different than Lott did. Thanks a million.
Okay, looks like we have 3 more questions.
Okay.
If you can hang in.
I can hang.
All right, so I have 2 questions for you.
We have 4 more questions.
The first is, I'm going to give a hypothetical, if that's all right. There's a person who's about to die. They've been diagnosed with cancer, and they've been given 2 months to live. Does that give them the right to go and kill someone else? such as where you said if the mother were to die because of the baby, does that give the mother the right to kill the baby? And two, should pregnancy control pills be restricted because it would be restricting life?
Oh no, let me actually start by answering the second question concerning restricting, say, contraception, basically. No, there is a moral distinction between choosing not to have children and then to interrupt the process after a child has been conceived and they already have a life. I mean, one of those actions violates the Declaration of Independence and the other doesn't. So, I mean, there's a huge difference between deciding not to have kids and then killing the ones that you've already conceived. So, I certainly would not treat them equally because they're not. But I will circle around back to the first question that you asked. It just raises the issue of whether a woman has a right to have an abortion to save her life. And there can be a cancer situation where that's necessary. When I talk about a legitimate health exception, obviously the first thing I talk about is ectopic pregnancy. Another one would be an example where the woman has uterine cancer and she happens to be pregnant at that point. Does she have a right? Yes. I mean, let's think about this for a second. If we are to say that the unborn, from the point of conception, are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, obviously the woman has those as well. Okay? They're not equal to one another. Life comes before liberty or pursuit of happiness. If we were to say that you could take away someone's life because they interfere with your liberty or your pursuit of happiness, then that would just be absurd because natural rights would be reduced to a form of words. You could kill anyone for any reason whatsoever. But when the right to life is pitted against an equal right to life, there you have an objective justification for taking life. It's just a necessity. It's a matter of self-defense we've always recognized at common law and in the Constitution.
Thank you for this evening.
Thank you for coming.
The inanimate precursors in the Big Bang Theory ultimately produce animacy. So you have inanimate objects, and then through whatever process, they become animate. That's the basic description of the Big Bang Theory. So in the abortion issue, you begin with animacy, and then because we are unable to determine if it's human or not, the fetus is, it becomes inanimate. And that, have you ever had that discussion or that argument put forth?
I haven't, and I would just question the premise, the idea that we don't know when life begins or when someone becomes human. I think actually that that's settled by the science of embryology. But so I would disagree with the premise and say I haven't heard the argument. Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm. She has note cards. You're dangerous. Are you the last person?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, look, I've got to go. My office is a long way away. Okay, note card person, fire away.
Hi. My question is in regards to the case involving the third trimester and how that is technically considered life, but under certain circumstances you're allowed to terminate the pregnancy. And also, I guess I was just wondering technically what the scientific definition of life is and how we can work to change Roe versus Wade and things like this that are already in place.
Well, that's interesting, and I don't have a textbook definition of what life is, okay? It is generally agreed upon at the point of conception when you have a being that's dividing cells and actively involved in its own development. Clearly, without a doubt, that is a life. And you've raised an interesting question with regard, I want to link those together. You talked about this issue of certainty on when life begins and then this issue of the third trimester. This is what is so utterly bizarre about Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade says that a woman's right to have an abortion is tied to the question of when life begins. But it says, you know what, there's this absence of consensus on when life begins, so we really don't know. If you don't know when life begins, then you don't know what a woman's reproductive rights are. It's a nonsensical opinion from the start. And then all of a sudden they do something weird where they say, oh, well, you certainly know by the point of viability. okay? And you have that very strange thing that's going on in the third trimester, and you see that that's not valid. Nowhere in the science of embryology does a textbook say that life begins when you become viable. So what do you do about this absolute train wreck of pretending that viability is relevant and pretending that you don't know when life begins? That's where Congress comes along and passes an official definition of what a person is. Congress has the right to come along and statutorily declare this is what a person is. And the Supreme Court would be bound by that. But our Congress does not have the courage to do that. We can codify in statute what the science of embryology already tells us, and we should do it. There's one political candidate out there who really wants to do that, but I don't want to interject my preferences in the next election into this discussion, so take a look on the internet and I'll let you figure it out, and I'll just give you a hint. He's a medical doctor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Your questions are awesome. God bless you all. Thanks so much.
Thank Dr. Adams for coming out. My name is Aaron Marshall. I'm the chapter director for Christi here at UNCW. Outside at our table, Madison will be there, Emma will be there, I'll be there, Dr. Adams will be around. We hope that this is
Hiking home.
Hiking and hiding. We hope that this is the beginning of a discussion at our meetings and everything that we do. We want to have these discussions. If you disagree with what Dr. Adams had to say, we hope that we can have these conversations with you now and in the future. So please come talk to us. We have, Fletcher Armstrong is here also with the Center for Bioethical Reform. There will be some pro-life training in March. If you're interested in going deeper in this, please come and sign up, and we give you some more information about when that will be. It'll be on a Sunday in March, and we'd love to see lots of people come out and to get trained. You already had some really great training to go even further in understanding and be able to articulate the pro-life position. And lastly, since we are a Christian, unapologetically a Christian apologetics organization, if we could, I'd just like to close this in prayer real quick. Dear Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity that you've given us to hear what is true, to hear about the sanctity of all life, Lord. And I thank you for Dr. Adams and the courage that he has to proclaim this message on campuses all across the country, Lord. And I pray that all of us will be, that we'll have our hearts and our minds changed on this issue, and that we'll have the courage to speak up for those of us who can't speak for themselves, Lord. And so I pray that there are even those here today, right now, who have their minds changed on this issue, Lord. And ultimately, just like Dr. Adams said, Lord, we're not here to guilt people for past decisions, Lord. We're here to change people's minds about future decisions. And ultimately, the only decision that's going to matter for any of us, Lord, is what we do with your Son. And so I pray that all of us understands that true life and mercy and sanctification and everything, Lord, comes through your Son, Jesus Christ. And so what happened at the cross is the salvation that we're all looking for. And I pray that those who don't know that today will find it. And I pray that you can use us on this campus and in this town to be a part of that journey. So I thank you again for Dr. Adams. I thank you for the people that came and listened tonight. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Good. You almost thought that. Hey, thank you so much again. Thank you.